perquè tenim poc temps i tenim moltes ganes d'escoltar a la Laura Sjoberg, si pronuncio bé. Doncs bé, jo personalment també tinc moltíssimes ganes i és un gran honor poder-la presentar perquè fa molt de temps que la segueixo, que he llegit coses d'ella i que de fet m'ha influenciat bastant en la manera que tinc d'entendre també el món, les relacions internacionals i els conflictes armats i per tant per mi és un gran plaer poder-la presentar. Ràpidament, per qui no la conegueu, doncs ella ha estudiat a diverses universitats dels Estats Units, de fet és dels Estats Units, però ara i també ha treballat allà a diverses universitats i ara recentment des del 2020 és professora global, que se'n diu, professora global de Política i Relacions Internacionals de l'Acadèmia Britànica a la Royal Holloway, Universitat de Londres i també cap, ara des de fa també poquet, cap del Departament de Política, Relacions Internacionals i Filosofia de la mateixa universitat. A més, ha estat professora de diferents assignatures, de dret internacional, de gènere i conflictes armats, de teories de les relacions internacionals i de seguretat internacional. La seva investigació, i el que crec que és molt interessant que puguem escoltar avui, és que aborda temes, òbviament, de gènere i seguretat, de teories feministes en els conflictes armats, en la seguretat, amb l'objectiu global, segons el que ella mateixa explica i segons la seva trajectòria, de posar i situar l'anàlisi feminista en el centre del debat i en el centre de l'estudi de temes de seguretat, guerra i conflictes armats, no només com una part del que hauríem d'estudiar, sinó al centre i una part fonamental de com entendre els conflictes armats i com entendre les relacions internacionals. I alhora, com a bona feminista, també segueix fixant-se en els marges i en la importància del que aquests marges ens poden explicar sobre el conjunt de comportaments, de concepcions i actuacions en la guerra. És a dir, una mica aquesta relació entre el macro i el micro, com el micro pot explicar part del macro i com el macro també explica l'impacte que té a nivell micro. En aquest sentit, s'ha centrat també en temes que potser desafien aquesta narrativa més habitual i potser més essencialitzadora del gènere en els conflictes armats, aquesta narrativa de les dones com a més pacifistes, que com bé dèieu, que hem d'agafar part d'aquests exemples, i també hi ha l'altra part, d'intentar trencar aquestes narratives que potser, com ella explicarà, hi ha altres narratives interessants que es poden estudiar i que ens aporten moltes coses. Estudiant, per exemple, les dones políticament violentes, la sexualitat a la política global. Bé, de fet, ha escrit en moltes temàtiques relacionades, ha publicat en més de 50 llibres, revistes de ciències polítiques, de dret, d'estudis de gènere, relacions internacionals, etc. Alguns llibres recents que ha publicat, que volíem esmentar, que són, a part d'alguns que són més tècnics o més de metodologies, així, els que ens apliquen i que són interessants, que us convido a llegir, hi hauria un que traduiré, que és Women's Wartime Rapists, dones com a violadores en temps de guerra. Després un manual sobre gènere i seguretat, gènere i victimització de civils i moltes altres que són també molt interessants. A part d'articles potser més curts, que potser és més assequible també, on ha explorat des dels estudis de crítics de seguretat, el que hem après dels estudis crítics i el que diguéssim que ha fracassat, les caracteritzacions de les dones dins i al voltant de l'estat islàmic, aquesta hipervisibilització o de vegades invisibilització, quan operen aquestes diferències, i fins i tot la sexualitat en l'acostament entre Estats Units i Cuba. I ara mateix, de fet, fa un temps, està treballant en un llibre que sembla que serà molt interessant, amb moltes ganes també de llegir-lo, que es dirà sobre el tema de relacions sexuals com a relacions internacionals. I aquest explorarà, en principi, uns 500 anys d'història, o sigui que ja veurem, serà interessant. I llavors avui ella ens parlarà, com teniu al programa, de seguretat feminista i teories crítiques de seguretat per prendre decisions polítiques que evitin la guerra. Sense més, et passo la paraula. Gràcies.
Is this on or do I have to turn it on?
Yeah, you just...
Okay. I tend to talk too loud, so tell me if I am. Thank you very much for having me. I'm excited to be at this conference and excited to hear and learn from everyone else and hopefully have something useful to share. I've very much enjoyed meeting some of you over the course of the last day and a half, and I hope I have a chance to interact with more of you as we continue the conference. I am going to talk a little bit about feminist decisions that can be made that I think will help think about and help make peace more viable and more popular and more interesting in a variety of different political contexts. Like someone who spoke before, I think that peace is an ideal and that it's a question of building towards it instead of building away from it. But I think that there are a lot of values and ideas that feminist security theory might have that could be helpful. So since I have limited time, I've picked 5 because I figure that's good for attention spans and stuff like that. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about those 5. The first one is choosing to value values and traits associated with femininity. So that's a little bit different than saying choosing to include women. And I think that choosing to include women is also important, but often when you choose to include women and only choose to include women and you look for peace, you're holding women to a higher standard than you're holding the men around them. So you're saying not only do you have to do the job of participating, you need to do it better than all the men that did it for hundreds of years. And so here's the higher standard that you have to meet. So I don't think that should be on women and only women. I think it's great when women have values associated with femininity and when they find spaces to make that work. But I also think that it's the responsibility of people that aren't women to espouse values associated with femininity as well. And I think that it's really those changes in values that end up making a bigger difference than the changes in demographics. Cynthia Enloe said 50 years ago-ish that militaries could add women and end up exactly the same. I think that was a little bit of an overstatement, and I think that we see militaries that have added women look a little different, but let's be honest, not a lot different. And I think that what's missing in a lot of those places is the values that some people assumed would come with the women. Values like listening and empathy and nonviolence and care. Those are the values that aim towards peace. And sometimes we expect that if we get women involved, we will also get those values. But sometimes we find that women don't have those values. And sometimes we find that even women who have those values have trouble being the only voice with them in male-dominated and masculine-dominated environments. So the more people who think about conflict with values associated with femininity, the more likely we are to go towards peace instead of away from it. And in my view, that means not just leaders, although that would help a lot, because some of them have values that are so far from femininity that I want to run and hide, but also individuals as we navigate the everyday life of conflict. Because sometimes some of the masculinist values that are so prevalent in our leadership end up being a part of our discourses even by accident. Carol Cohn wrote a piece in the 1980s about how she'd spent 6 weeks with the US defense industry and how she found herself using the masculinist language that they used, even though she was there to critique it. So she had gone knowing it was a problem and knowing that she thought she couldn't, it's a bad idea to use. And yet she spent so much time with the people that she started talking like them. And she said, as I started talking like them, I worried I would also start thinking like them. So to me, the alternative is to start talking like femininity and to try and then make talking like femininity translate into thinking like femininity. Which brings me to the second decision that I think that feminist theory suggests that one should make, which is to have a broader understanding of violence than the policy world is used to, particularly the military policy world. I remember hearing Bill Clinton talk about sanctions on Iraq as a nonviolent alternative to war. So first, sanctions, pretty damn violent, actually. Second, the United States dropped more tons of bombs on Iraq in the 1990s than it used in the entirety of the Second World War. So nonviolence was a combination of starving people and bombing them at an unprecedented level. And he wasn't kidding or being sarcastic. He actually meant it, right? He thought that was nonviolent compared to some other options that he might have had. I don't think he thought about all the options, but because I can think of some actually nonviolent ones. But generally speaking, there's a very narrow definition of violence that happens among the most violent political organizations, where they don't count drone strikes as violent, where they don't count bombings as violent, where they pretty much think about violence as one-on-one, hand-to-hand combat, and that's it. And spoiler alert, that doesn't happen all that often anymore, though it does still happen. But generally speaking, a lot of feminist theorists of security have thought about violence as not a dichotomy. So there's not nonviolence and violence, and those are the only options. It's instead a continuum where you're really talking about levels and types of violence instead of nonviolence and violence. And on one hand, that takes away the ideal of nonviolence to strive for. On the other hand, it encourages personal responsibility and engagement with the violence that one is a part of or complicit with or responsible for. So for example, I'm not comparing either the level or type of violence that I do as a white American feminist going around telling people what I think to the level and type of violence that Bill Clinton did when he bombed Iraq so much. But they're both violence. One isn't nonviolence. And when you think about it like that, then you can think about how these artificial, well, the war began on this day and the war ended on that day, actually end up doing more harm than good. In part because the consequences of war and conflict on civilians, and particularly on female civilians, is shown to often be worse after the war ended than during the war. And it's shown to go on for not just days or weeks or months, but decades. But of course, everybody else is celebrating that the war is over and there's no more violence, when really the war didn't start when the war started, and the war didn't end when the war ended. And the level of violence that happens in and around war and conflict is much broader and much deeper than often a number of people who are involved in the making and fighting of wars are able to comprehend. They also distance or dehumanize or desensitize about the violence. For a long time, I taught international security class in the United States. And it turns out that the people who take international security class are the ones that like war. And so they would always come, thinking, where's the next war? How am I going to make the next war? So the second week of the class, I would show the movie Saving Private Ryan, which is a very, very sanitized version of war and conflict. It's barely rates as something pseudo-realistic, very sanitized. And all the students who wanted to make War the week before say that it's too violent for them and they can't watch it. And I'm like, well, what did you want to do? And in some different version, they all said, well, somebody else does the fighting. I just do the policy making. And I was like, well, then you've got to watch that because you want to make people do that even if it's not you. And that's something that really a lot of people don't deal with. So I think a continuum approach to violence through feminist lenses says that the violence is here, not there. And the violence is in our decisions and in our discourses. And those things end up mattering as a condition of possibility of the violence that actually happens, whether it's in our backyard or all the way across the world. So a continuum approach to violence, I think, is a foundation for the third decision that I think you can make from a feminist perspective. And that is an approach that emphasizes empathy. I used to think empathy was the idea that I can understand what you think, and therefore, even if I disagree, I feel in my heart that you're coming from the right place. And I think that's something. But I actually think a braver and more important sort of empathy is a sort of empathy that respects those you do not understand and those whose position you can't reason through in your head, and those who might be the exact opposite or on the other side of a conflict from you. Because it doesn't mean that you have to get it, and it doesn't mean that you have to be converted to some idea that someone else has. But if we can't empathize with those we might consider enemies, then the alternative to empathy is often dehumanization. It's, well, we can't understand that position, or that position is wrong, or those people are less than human because they have that position. Being a Southern American, I've met some people I'd like to say that about, but I try not to. But the problem with any approach other than empathy is it lets us take degrees of separation from the decisions that we make around conflicts. Because if someone isn't fully human, fully feeling, fully cognizant in your mind, then it affects how you allow yourself to treat them. And so to me, when there's something that I don't understand, I'll be honest, I'm probably not the best at empathy as a feminist value. But I have noticed that trying to practice empathy narrows the spectrum of responses in conflict. So there are some things that you would say, some things that you would do, some weapons, either verbal or physical, that you would use, that you can't use if you constantly remind yourself of the humanness and emotionality of the people around you. And that needs to be the case, however, unfortunately, whether or not they do the same thing. So one of the hardest parts of empathizing is empathizing with people who are not empathetic and who will dehumanize you. And I'm not suggesting that it's okay to be dehumanized or disrespected, or that it's okay to have violence performed against you, not at all. And I do think that it is okay to not be okay with that. In fact, I wouldn't generally characterize myself as a pacifist, which is something that maybe we can talk about later. But for the purpose of this decision and this decision making, my point is that reacting with empathy in the face of the opposite of empathy is actually one way to de-escalate conflict. It turns out, actually, that some people who want to start conflicts or who want to escalate conflicts are really looking for a response in kind. And I don't know if anyone ever told you on the playground when you were a kid, well, just don't respond to the bully. I never managed that. But I hear that if you did manage it, what happens is that the bully gets bored. I don't know if that's true. It certainly didn't work to respond to the bully, so I'm open to other opportunities. But I do think that empathy as a feminist value is an important one, because it suggests that care isn't only limited to those with whom you have things in common or those with whom you might agree. That care is instead a value that is a property of humanness instead of a property of friendship or alliance or nationality or commonality. And that if care is a property of humanness, then looking at security might be a positive thing instead of a negative thing. Which I guess kind of brings me to the fourth decision that I think that feminists might help us make about security. And that decision is about the impacts of what you decide rather than the intent. I don't know how many times I've seen an argument, whether in personal life or political life, where somebody says, you did a bad thing to me. And the response is, I didn't mean to. And emotionally, that matters. It's certainly a different thing to do something bad when you mean to than when you don't. But it doesn't actually impact the effects that a decision has. And very often we look to see, well, is somebody doing something for the right reasons, or are they trying? And for a lot of reasons, that really matters. But I think for the making of peace, it doesn't always matter. Because a negative impact happens whether you want it to or not. Returning to my sad example of Bill Clinton and sanctions, do I think he intended to starve people in Iraq? Probably not. I don't know. I don't know him. But I think probably not. It doesn't matter, because he did. And in some sense, I didn't mean to is a way not to take responsibility for the problem. And so to me, it matters that you know I didn't mean to do something bad, because it matters that you know me, and it matters that you know my feelings and my heart. But it doesn't matter in terms of my responsibility for the impacts of what I do, that I didn't mean for it to be bad. And I think that that's something really important to think about when we're negotiating settlements and when we're thinking about making peace between entities that are in conflict, that sometimes the fact that you didn't mean to or the fact that it's not your fault doesn't particularly matter. It doesn't make, for example, the ways that our states treat a number of the people that were indigenous to those states, that it happened hundreds of years ago originally. It does continue to happen, but it happened hundreds of years ago originally, and many of our ancestors didn't even live in the state then. It doesn't matter. Because it matters that that treatment continues, and it matters that it continues to have impact. So as a white American, it doesn't matter that I say, well, I didn't participate in that, nor did my ancestors. It matters that the United States is doing it. And so to me, paying attention to the impacts is a good feminist way to think about paying attention to how to make peace, rather than intent. Which I guess brings me to the last decision that I think it's really important to make as a feminist when you think about looking for peace. And that is every political situation, every decision, every security matrix, every city, every state, is so complicated that soundbite politics has no place in peace. And I understand that soundbite politics is really the way of politics. But I think that every time you say something about a conflict, every time you think something about a conflict, it often comes out in kind of a very short and very pithy sort of way of thinking about it, right? That this situation can be described very quickly. And sometimes the most important things can. But every time you look a little bit deeper, there's much more complexity to something than can be in a tweet or a 2-minute speech or a 5-minute speech or a 5-hour speech. Politicians often make those, I tend to avoid them. And instead, one thing that's important to notice when you're thinking about and trying to practice peace is that there's inevitable complexity. And that complexity is gendered, it's raced, it's intersectional. It has a lot to do with different positionalities in the world. And so anytime you can say, I can tell you this conflict in 5 seconds, you're leaving so much out that even if the 5-second version of telling the conflict ends up being the version that everyone hears, if the most you can do is say, in your head, I realize that 5-second version isn't enough, that's probably something too. So I guess to conclude, to me, it's very important to say that women need to be represented in the halls of government, in the halls of financial sectors that are as important to conflict as government, in the halls of peace movements, negotiations, courts, which often do a lot of the very important deciding about how conflict is negotiated, and even in militaries, though I wish they did not exist. That part's crucially important. I think women should be in all of those spaces, even if they don't change them a little bit, or even if they change them for the worse, because it doesn't necessarily matter what people do, they need to be represented. But then I hope that the increased representation of women ends up also highlighting values associated with femininity and alternative ways to think about, approach, and articulate conflicts, which might be more supportive of peace than the ways that our dominant masculinist warmonger, I like that word, warmonger groups do in current parlance. I think it's sad that that change is probably going to end up being more incremental than we wish it was. But at the same time, maybe the way to make it less incremental is to hold ourselves personally responsible for being that change. Okay, I think that's it, and I can do questions.
Moltes gràcies, i a més per fer-ho tan clar i tan ajustat al temps. Ara el que faríem seria potser fer una ronda de preguntes i potser mentre hi haurà un micro, no sé qui el té el micro. Aquí. Algun senyor de Delàs que volia fer-ho. Gràcies. No, noi. I hi ha preguntes allà. Jo també tinc algunes preguntes, però deixaré primer el David, my student. El de les ulleres. I després a darrere. I després darrere. Take a few questions. No. It's recorded, so we need to... And translate it.
Oh, yeah, the translated part.
Yeah. Que necessitem que funcioni pel vídeo i per les intèrpretes. No, potser mentre... Si va ràpid, si no, pregunto jo, Vale, faig una pregunta i després seguim amb vosaltres. No, sorry. No, it's just because the interpreters are not going to listen, hear it. So I'll ask my question then.
Okay.
Well, I have a few, but actually I'm just going to ask one. Yeah. So when you were talking about including values that are traditionally associated with femininity, I was thinking about some. Perdó. I'm speaking English. Vale. Doncs que quan estàs... Bueno, això, no? Pensava molt en el tema de les emocions, que potser ja has tocat, però a les emocions en general, no? Que molt sovint es diu que hem de ser racionals i que s'ha de parlar des de la part racional, i ho sentim molt també des dels moviments. I volia preguntar-te de quina manera veus integrar o com s'han de treballar les emocions en general, com donar-los un valor també en la nostra anàlisi. No només a l'hora de respondre o a l'hora de parlar, sinó també en la nostra anàlisi dels conflictes armats i de la situació i del licisme, etc. Seria la primera que tinc. Tenim micro? No, encara no. So maybe if you can answer this, because we're still...
Okay. Thank you so much for speaking a little bit about feminist values and
Maybe.
Yeah, try and speak directly into it. Nothing? Okay.
Do you want to come here? Sí. Ara bé.
Thank you so much for speaking. Thank you so much for speaking and introducing all these feminist ideas. And I kind of had a question, because you mentioned not specifically being like a pacifist. So how do you incorporate these feminist ideas into things like peacekeeping missions and other like interventions in conflicts where there's less willingness to work for peace, but there's still a need to like stop direct violence, if you know what I mean?
Jo parlaré en català, vale? Dos qüestions que se n'olviden en totes les guerres, però les mares ens treuen els fills per anar a les guerres i llavors ens deixen a vosaltres calleu. No, ens invisibilitzen, d'acord, com mares. I la segona qüestió, que penso que les dones no volen aquest poder masculí. No? Ens falta que les dones tinguin més ganes, o hem de canviar tot, perquè la meva pregunta avui dia és quina estructura de poder ha d'haver-hi, o no, perquè la dona participi en tots els nivells.
Algú vol apuntar a fer alguna pregunta o estem aquí?
Okay, sorry. All right. Okay, thank you for the very interesting questions. I think maybe I'll go a little bit in order. I think it's very strange because the very same people who would say that war isn't about emotions will always use people's emotions to get them involved in the war, right? Like, so even like the early stuff, feminist work on military recruitment said that men are much more willing to fight for their mothers than they are for their countries. So military recruitment strategies suggested trying to get mothers to guilt trip men into fighting, right? And in some sense, that means that the very traditional war machine relies on emotions. But then it wants to kick the emotions out when it's done with them, instead of paying attention to the complexity of human emotion. And it certainly doesn't want the emotion of care to come into the war field, because that would mean that a lot of the behaviors that militaries find everyday and acceptable wouldn't be. If you had to feel for and with and around the people you were charged with killing, I don't think no killing would happen, but a lot less killing would happen. And it would be a lot harder to do. And so to me, I saw a debate one time around Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign. Apparently she cried sometime, don't know when, but it happened. And then somebody put in a newspaper, well, would you want someone who was emotional to have their finger on the nuclear button? Okay, first, there's no button, but you know. And you know, your initial reaction to that is no, but in 2 seconds, the answer is obviously yes. You would never want someone without emotion to make a decision like that. And yet that's the thing that the traditional war arena tends to prize. So to me, the more you say to do war, you have to feel it, I think the less war there would be. I'm not a pacifist, but not a big fan of intervention. So I think that it's not the peacekeeping and peacemaking forces that I would divorce pacifism for. I think it's actually that I'm worried that there are some causes unjust enough that even a losing fight against them is better than not fighting at all. So to me, I think the place where I wouldn't be a pacifist is I don't want to say that there are some human rights violations that you should just live with because fighting against them isn't okay. And I know there are more things to do than fighting. And I'm not suggesting that fighting is a first or second or even third resort. But I do think that saying you can never use violence suggests both that the continuum approach to violence isn't a thing, and also that there aren't things that are worse than traditional violence. And I think there probably are. So that's, I think, why I'm not a pacifist. I do think that feminist security studies can provide advice for things like interventionist forces. I'd prefer that they didn't exist at all, but they could do a little bit more in the empathy and communication realm if they did exist. And so I think you don't have to agree with me to take some of these values into account in the different parts of the security realm. In terms of structures to include women, I think those are really hard, much harder than they look, because you don't want structures that instrumentalize women, right? You don't want structures that use women to say we're doing good while they continue to do bad. You don't want structures that use women and continue to be gender subordinating. And yet, it is of course true that war and conflict have many, many, many gendered impacts. And it's also true that those gendered impacts don't usually get a voice at the table of peace negotiations or ceasefire negotiations or the ways that conflicts might end. So to me, I think maybe it's not a question of a structure. Maybe it's a question of a lot of structures. And maybe the role of some women who get involved is to talk about the role of motherhood in conflict. The role of some women to get involved is to talk about human rights or civilian victimization. The role of some women to get involved is to look as mean and nasty as the men they're arguing against are looking. And maybe all of those things need to happen together instead of separately. So that's my best answer to a really hard question.
Doncs agafem una ronda més i aprofiteu que allà... De moment, molt bé.
I'm really curious about your books. My question is, I really appreciate the values that you mentioned. Listening, empathy, nonviolent communication. Can these values be seen as attitudes and skills? So, and can this be, the way I understand, for me it's the first time I'm not familiar with feminine or masculine values. So my perception is that maybe women can be more skilled on these specific skills and attitudes which are the most relevant to work for peace, for example, the ones that you mentioned. So I'm not sure about the pros and cons and considering values as feminine or masculine. I'm not sure if they are more like the fact that a gender is more skilled than others. I'm not sure if it's because of gender or it's more because of culture, education, or social construction. So this is my question. What extent is because of gender and what extent is because of politics?
Allà n'hi havia una, sí, i després en Toni. I si s'animen les dones, també estaria bé que preguntin.
About conflict, the question of prevention of recruitment of minors. Do you think it should be different proactive policy distinguishing recruitment of women? Like the recruitment of minors is a major thing on conflict, an ongoing conflict, by not formal military organizations. And the recruitment of women is a major issue. The recruitment of youth women or youth men is a major issue. The question is, do you think that in order to work in prevention, a specific proactive policy should be tailoring women differently, or like youth women different than youth men?
Should we take a moment?
Yeah, that's fine.
Jordi.
Gràcies. Tinc dues preguntes molt ràpides. Una és, estàvem parlant de seguretat i del lideratge, i parlant del lideratge m'ha fet pensar també en com això pot estar relacionat amb l'economia, com una economia, quina relació li veus a la qüestió de la seguretat amb el model econòmic, amb el capitalisme, si tindria un component també de valors més contraris als feministes o no. I després una pregunta una mica més pràctica. Nosaltres pensem que la seguretat feminista podria ser una alternativa a la seguretat militarista o belicista, o en la que l'ús de la força és la manera d'aconseguir aquesta seguretat. I la pregunta seria quines tecles podríem tocar, jo amb la seva experiència estudiant-ho molts anys, quines tecles podríem tocar en un moment determinat per a intentar que en un govern concret es pogués caminar més cap a una seguretat feminista que no cap a la que hi ha ara.
Okay, maybe I will try to go in order again. I usually use the phrase values associated with femininities and values associated with masculinities. And I use those phrases because I don't think there's anything innate about sex or gender that is a part of a person. But I do think that there's long-standing traditions of associating values and therefore teaching people those values and kind of making those values be a part of education and generational raising and things like that. And they're not the same everywhere. They exist everywhere, but they're not the same everywhere. And so I think I use values associated with femininity as a shorthand for the ways that women were taught and trained and disciplined to be for a very long time and probably continuing till now. A mentor of mine once did a mathematical model of when the US Congress would become sex equal. So when there would be as many women as men in the US Congress. And her model said that it would become sex equal in the year 2450. So that's fun. And I tell you this because the analogy she made after that is kind of how I make sense of the changing of gender in leadership. So she said, if the US Congress were sex equal tomorrow, would it behave radically differently than it does now? Yes. If it were sex equal in 2450, would it behave radically differently? Probably not. Because the gradual integration of women into values associated with masculinity would be how that trajectory happened. Whereas if you change the people in power now, whether actually on gender or some other axis of disempowerment, of course it would be different, because that exclusion isn't just on the basis of inhabiting a body that is female. It's also on the basis of particular values that are not valued in political and particularly security arenas. So I think that's what I mean, is that the traits that we traditionally associate with women and femininity are the ones that it might be more important to value in a security sphere that has generally only valued a particular subset of traits associated with masculinity. Right, hegemonic traits associated with masculinity. And to me, that's, I think, where it ends up being a problem from my understanding. But I know that lots of people differ on that, so that's just my view of how it happens. In terms of the recruitment of minors, there's a lot of securitization of young men that sometimes, to me, seems to go beyond the actual potential of young men to be recruited, right? And it makes young men into something dangerous before they ever might become something dangerous. And in the same way, often young women are treated as necessarily not dangerous. And so sometimes a lot of the anti-child recruitment work that goes on, especially in the UN, is focused on young men to the exception of young women, where it's assumed that young women who are a part of organizations are kidnapped or something like that rather than joining, or manipulated or something like that, whereas young men are apparently adventurous and go make choices. And of course, that dichotomy doesn't work at all for me. I both think that it's really important to pay attention to all of the ways in which conflict recruitment is manipulative. And then also to say, well, it's not okay to recruit minors, it's not okay to use minors. But how did we get to a point where that's the line we draw? Right? How did we get to a point where if you're 17 years old, it's not cool, but on your 18th birthday, go ahead, go take a, automatic weapon and have some fun, right? And at least for me, seeing automatic weapons in the hands of 20-something-year-olds scares me, and it might just be that I'm getting old. And it's not particularly pleasant anywhere. But I do think that it's also important to see this as a continuum and to see where it became okay to do everything else and not this. And that might tell us why it became okay to do this. In terms of the questions about the economy, I think capitalism is necessarily sexist and racist in many very important ways. I think the capitalist class has done a great job of securitizing profit, right? Where profit is something that is acceptable to kill over. And that profit is often talked about in nationalist terms to get people who are not sharing in the profit to kill over the profit anyway. And I also think it's really important to pay attention to those people and those companies who profit off of war and conflict, right? War is actually quite a lucrative business. And there are then those people who find doing that lucrative business and encouraging it to happen profitable for themselves and others. And I think failing to recognize that, however hard it is, makes fighting against it even harder. And so I think it's really important to pay attention to the political economy of conflict on a macro level, and also that war and conflict affects all sorts of microeconomies in very, very deep and very, very gendered ways. So, for example, in conflict zones, the ways in which people's caloric intakes decrease are gendered, right? The ways in which access to medicine changes is gendered. The way in which one finds basic household goods becomes more dangerous. And it's often women or people in caring positions that have to go find those basic household goods. So the economic dangers associated with conflict are sometimes indivisible from the mainstream actual bombing parts of conflict. And I think that that's really important to pay attention to, especially when you're paying attention to gender.
Moltes gràcies, Laura. Gràcies a totes per les preguntes, tots, sobretot, per les preguntes. I res, que ha estat un plaer. Ens quedaríem aquí molta més estona, segurament, però com que tenim el temps bastant just, doncs haurem de passar a l'altra taula. Gràcies.